My name is Siri Gloppen. I'm director of the Center on Law and Social Transformation, which hosts this event, and I'm also a professor at the Department of Government. And I've been really looking forward to this seminar. And the three of us who will be on stage later decided that even if nobody else was coming, it was worthwhile. Because when we had a trial run, we had such a fun time. So I'm sure this will be great. But of course, you didn't come to listen to me. You came to listen to the other speakers. And first, we'll hear from Braconnier De León. And she is a researcher at the Universidad Rafael Landívar. I don't think I've ever said that before, in Guatemala. And she's also a fellow at the Center on Law and Social Transformation. And she is this semester a guest researcher at the Department of Comparative Politics at the University of Braconnier. And you've been here since June. And unfortunately, you're leaving next week, but we think it's only temporary and that you'll be back. And you will talk about work that you've done for a long time on these matters. And we'll hear from you first, and then we'll also have your interlocutor on stage, but I'll just briefly present him as well. So Aaron Spitzer, and I think you all know him actually, but he's an associate professor at the Department of Comparative Politics, and he also directs a research project from the European Research Council called Confront. I know this! Constitution. Contested frontiers in settler states. And you're a professor, associate professor of Arctic and Indigenous governance, which is very much what we're going to talk about today. And I also forgot to say that Anna is a researcher on another project that's very much related to this, and that's based at the Christian Michelsen Institute, which is in this house, which is called Pluriland, which is contestations over over land rights and plural legal regimes, which is also very much what we're going to talk about today. So this will be a very research, sort of a conversation based on long-term research into these issues and questions. And the backdrop is it's complex in some ways because there are different things that come into play. So if we look at it over like 5 decades, there has been an increase in protection of Indigenous rights and Indigenous land rights, both in international law and in many countries, not least in Latin America, but also around the world, and also in the Arctic. And but at the same time, we're seeing these have always been contested, but they're increasingly contested in the context of democratic backsliding that we're seeing in many countries, but also where there is not particularly necessarily so much democratic backsliding. That we see that there is an increasing contestation, particularly over land rights, and so this is part of the backdrop. So there are these rights that are in some ways becoming more institutionalized and at the same time more contested in the current context, and which also raises questions about what sort of this is a judicial path. Are the courts strong enough to secure these paths, and what are all the ways of Indigenous the paths that might sort of lead towards Indigenous self-determination. So that is or autonomy in some way. So that's part of the backdrop, and then of course there is also a global security situation that puts these issues into play in a particular way. So it will be a very interesting discussion. We will open up in the last 15 minutes for you. So just take note, and we'll throw you the microphone. But first, Anna.
Here, right? Yeah. Hello. Yeah. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see all the friends and colleagues and the students that I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to take more or less 10 minutes just to present the general overview of the topic for today. And let's see, yes. So the new political constitutions in the 80s in Latin America were crafted to address the transitions toward democracy. This neo-constitutionalism established specific collective rights to indigenous peoples. Some of these rights are cultural, such as the right to the bilingual education, and others are territorial, like the right to indigenous traditional land ownership. The 1990s represented in Latin America a decade of hope for building a nascent multicultural democracies where the states would respect, promote, and protect indigenous people's self-determination as written in for instance, the Guatemalan political constitution, which is the picture we can see here during the Constitutional Assembly in 1984 and 5. After 36 years of counterinsurgent war, massive land grabs, and ending with a genocide against indigenous Maya peoples in the early 80s, the Guatemalan Constitution was one of the first to recognize identity-based rights in Latin America. Since the 80s today, so for about 40 years, indigenous peoples in the region have pursued efforts to enforce justice through recognition and redistribution, with mixed results today. Land rights are perhaps the most contested. It is the denomination for rights to land, territories, and resources. These rights are fundamental for indigenous peoples' self-determination, and indigenous politics have focused on guaranteeing them. These rights include waters, maritime zones, and sea areas traditionally used, occupied, or otherwise possessed by indigenous peoples living in coastal, riverine, or lake regions. These types of rights are becoming increasingly disputed as the demand for natural resources is more and more pressing. I included here these 3 examples of the wind energy in Sápmi, which is the one here in Norway that you might know better. I also included the salmon farming in Hualmapu in the south of Chile, which is also a topic that you in Norway could relate to, and also the Standing Rock protests in the United States, to open to different contexts where these contestations have been taking place. A lot has been said about how the green transition and the energy policies, and as you said, Siri, the new security policies are renewed forms of the same historical colonialism. The Sami people are at the forefront of this critical perspective on green energy. The Fosen case on eolics destroying the Sami culture and livelihoods and brought to the Norwegian Supreme Court is an example of how land rights are disputed before the courts and what the judicial responses are. Judicializations of indigenous land conflicts is happening everywhere, and the courts become a site that reveals the health of a democracy. So what can indigenous struggles reveal about the current global wave of democratic backsliding? To explore the question, let's go to Guatemala, what this Central American country can tell us. So even before the creation of the International Labor Covenant 169 on indigenous and tribal peoples in 1989, the Guatemalan government first recognized indigenous rights in 1985 and then in 1996 with the Peace Accords. Judicial institutions were designed to advance human rights and ensure judicial independence, and the many judicial reforms and international cooperation enhanced indigenous Maya lawyering, conducting robust strategic litigation on land claims and the right to free, prior, and informed consultation and consent. Relevant elements that make a democracy were supposed to be in place: a rule of law, judicial independence, and social structures supporting courts to pursue judicial accountability. However, power distribution, political and economic power, did not change much. The economic oligarchy, organized in the so-called Coordinating Committee of Agricultural, Commercial, and Industrial and Financial Associations, CACIF in short, ultimately designed the key political institutions to ensure their privileges and perpetuate the large agribusiness and the natural resource extraction mega projects. Land and waters have always been central assets for national economies, and they still are highly disputed. And I want to give you an example of what can be disputed and that you might also relate. So the Oshek case was a case judicialized in 2016 and 2017, and it related to the construction of 2 hydroelectric plants in the Cabon River on Maya Quechí territory in Guatemala. The Oshek company generates 6% of the country's hydropower, and the hydropower represents in the country between 40 and 50% of energy production, being the largest source of energy. The Cabon River is dammed by 4 other plants belonging to the largest Central American multinational Corporación Multinversiones, a different CMI, a key actor for the CACIF. This hydroelectric complex provides 1/4 of the electricity market intended for domestic consumption, mining activities, and export to Mexico and other Central American countries. So you can imagine that this case, when it was brought to the courts, it's brought a lot of nervousness to the oligarchy. According to the plaintiffs, a Quechí group, the company did not carry a proper free, prior, and informed consultation, and the construction of the 2 dams, the reservoirs, the plants, and the pipes were seriously deteriorating the woods and the river, which are the material basis for the Quechí livelihoods. On the other side, the Ministry of Energy and Mining and the Oshek company claimed to have outreached the villages through a series of jornadas informativas or information sessions to set a friendly agreement with a different group of Quechí neighbors. So they claimed that the free, prior, and informed consultation was carried out. And in addition, they argued that hydroelectricity is the cleanest energy and that it is central for the Guatemalan economy. For 7 months, the time to gather evidence and to deliberate, the Constitutional Court, for the first time in constitutional justice, ordered the suspension of the extractive license and the interruption of the dam's activity. The constitutional justices wanted to issue a structural ruling that would create a free, prior, and informed consultation protocol that would apply to future indigenous land conflicts. The majority of the justices in that court in 2017 were credibly committed to expand indigenous rights and protect the environment against savage extractivism, but the task was not easy. According to one of the interviewed justices, Bonerge Mejia, the 3 main difficult cases in Guatemalan constitutional justice have to deal with electoral matters, corruption matters, and indigenous people's rights matters because of the economic implications that they have for the oligarchy. In this case, the energy sector in particular triggered an intense counter-mobilizations to influence justice's arguments. Long story short, the most powerful law firms were insistently reaching out to the justices, inviting them to their country clubs, arguing why it was important to keep the clean energy, and in the worst scenario, harassing them to issue a convenient ruling to favor natural resource extraction sector, and that was going through like regular visits to the courts and making some pressures inside and outside the courts, formally and informally. Finally, and I'm a bit on my time, but I'm gonna finish my presentation. The Constitutional Court issued that structural ruling to solve a typical land rights conflict and mediate between indigenous land politics and the Guatemalan economy in the hands of powerful extractive corporations. The court ordered first that Congress must issue a consultation law. Second, it created a protocol for free, prior, and informed consultation, but where indigenous participation stays limited. And third, they allowed the dams to continue their activity. Although the ruling accommodated the economic interest, it triggered recalcitrant reactions from the oligarchy, and the court was labeled as being too activist. Ultimately, behind everything, there was a concern of the court violating the principles of private property and economic development. From that moment on, the Constitutional Court was under siege, as Bonerge Mejia described the situation they were living in the context of anti-corruption efforts and the attempts to limit savage extractivism. The outcomes today are that one, courts are complying with the economic and political elites, and two, that social and traditional indigenous structures are criminalized, in jail, or in exile. All prospects of judicial accountability are for now erased, and the natural resource extraction is in motion to dig deeper in search for raw materials. So to wrap up, this case reveals two key points that I think, and we will discuss them, regarding what we can think about democratic backsliding. First is that democracies have red lines that cannot be crossed. Judicial accountability of political and economic elites for privileges historically obtained through state and natural resource control. Resources control is like central for democracies. In case of crossing them, a judicial backlash is likely to happen, like in the case of Guatemala. In Guatemala, challenging the private property regime and the entrenched elite interest by advancing some indigenous land rights was unbearable. This political economy perspective on what matters most to the elites and the foundations of the economic regimes might be interesting to unpack in other cases that might be considered also as democracies. And second point, we also know what a democratic backsliding looks like, because there's been a lot of studies on autocratization in other regions of the world, and they have already done like extensive contributions on that. One of those is the political capture of judicial institutions in charge of constitutional review and human rights protections, and that is part of the manual of autocrats. What is important to highlight is the centrality of indigenous land control for extraction purposes, and for that aim, strategies are deployed. Repression against the leadership defending indigenous land rights, forced evictions in order to control the territory, and a recolonization of the rights discourse and the scope of what has called the free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous people's rights. So I leave it there, and thank you for listening.
So thank you so much, Anna. This was a great introduction to a lot of different issues that we can discuss. Erin, please. I think I'll answer to it.
Thanks, Anna. So one of the reasons why it has been so fun to have Anna as part of, she's been sitting in Sompol in the Department of Comparative Politics, sort of attached to my project, our project, over the past 6 months. And that has been really useful and eye-opening because even though, I mean, Anna obviously studies Indigenous political rights and governance and things like that. That's also what I do. But we do so in different in some ways, in different universes, right? You very much sort of represent or are from a Central American and a writ larger Latin American, writ even larger than that, global South perspective. The focus on Indigenous governance that I have sort of pursued throughout my academic career has very much been in the Anglo-settler states, so the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and also the Nordic states, so the Denoscandia, basically, as it relates to Sami governance. And those are, unlike the global South, those could be considered, maybe except for the United States now, developed, stable, liberal democracies in the global North. And I guess my not intervention, my addition to what Anna sort of was talking about was she was sort of pointing out about these different kinds of red lines that once they are crossed, there's potentially going to be a pushback against Indigenous rights. And in certain places like Guatemala, we see that through democratic backsliding. We see that maybe through autocratization or the clamping down on the freedom of the judiciary or things like that, right? We somewhat see different dynamics in the global North, in the Anglo-settler or the Nordic states. There are, I think, in those places still red lines, right? But the means by which those red lines are policed are perhaps slightly different, right? Instead of naked autocratization, there are at least two different tools that I've sort of been focusing on to police those red lines, right? One is a phenomena that now gets discussed a lot in the Anglo-settler states, and that is sort of, instead of the old-fashioned colonialism of Indigenous interests by sort of the state or by the oligarchs reaching directly into Indigenous lands and extracting resources against their will, there's been what could be called a neo-colonial turn, whereby you settle land claims with Indigenous peoples, you facilitate or permit the establishment of Indigenous governance structures, but you do so in a way that those Indigenous groups then themselves become dependent on or vulnerable to ostensibly inviting these very same oligarchic corporations onto their lands, right? And so there has been a turn, at least in the global North, from this overt old-fashioned colonialism to a kind of a neo-colonialism, where often Indigenous groups are, in order to facilitate their own self-government or because they're under sort of austerity from the state, where they don't have enough financial support from the state, they're forced to sort of support mining or oil extraction within their traditional territories. And that has sort of internalized this debate. So you now have Indigenous elites fighting amongst one another over the same kind of issues that they used to fight against the state with, right? And you You sort of even see that in Norway a little bit with, well, one of the most recent, the recent Sami election in Norway just 4 months ago or so. It saw a real rise of a sort of a slightly more pro-development Sami party called the Nordkalot Party, which is inspired, which was inspired to sort of run for seats in the Sami parliament because over the years, they have been frustrated by what they see as an anti-development, pro-reindeer herding agenda on the part of the more traditional NSR Sami. So you have this kind of internal self-colonization, if you will, in the global north. And then the other kind of, and this kind of ties in a little bit more with the democratic backsliding, but you have what I would call liberal forward sliding, where a lot of the opposition now to indigenous rights in the Anglo states is through the assertion of individual liberal rights of the settler majority. And so recently, me and some of the other Confront team, we were down in New Zealand. New Zealand has a conservative government now. There's been really a rolling back of Maori voting rights. That's been done through by appealing to the New Zealand human rights legislation, basically. The argument is that if you privilege Maori voting rights, well, that's a race-based discriminatory form of favoring one group over the other. So there's the anti-Maori forces have been able to appeal to the idea of egalitarianism, universalism, and inclusion in order to push back against group-differentiated indigenous rights. And you see that in other places like Australia, where there's resistance against indigenous control of sacred areas because that violates the freedom of mobility of all Australians. So white Australians argue, well, we should have the freedom to enter these places. In Northern Canada, there's an argument that non-Indigenous people should be able to vote in Indigenous governance mechanisms because they're affected by those mechanisms. Non-Indigenous people wildly outnumber Indigenous people, and through very democratic means can outvote and then control them. So that's not exactly democratic backsliding. Arguably, that's leveraging democracy, which is an old settler colonial trick. Anyway, that's all I'll say for now.
Can I just comment on that? Because I think it's interesting, because in a way it's the difference between the democratic element and the liberal element. Because the liberal element of protecting minorities is being challenged by the democratic element.
Exactly.
And I think that you see it beyond indigenous governance as well. I mean, all kinds of affirmative action mechanisms are like you have in, it's very, very common, obviously, in the US now that it's rolled back in education and everywhere.
Yep.
So I think that is a tension that is also broader, but very, very, very interesting.
Yep.
And it's very interesting that is on the rise, that a lot of what we talk about as democratic backsliding is actually liberal backsliding. So it's the liberal element that goes. It's not really the democratic element necessarily. It's the populist appeal to democracy. But anyway, but I just wanted, before we go, how does this look? Do you see the same tension also in Guatemala within the indigenous?
No, the divisionism within the indigenous peoples, it's very latent.
Yeah.
And I think that the cleavage is not like in dominant politics. The cleavage is not identity based. The cleavage is what are the interests, the economic interests that drive the mobilization and the use of identity to access to certain resources. And it's the same situation because inequality is very important in Latin America. And ways to address inequality, it's many times through the economic activities. And then there's this hegemonic discourse of mega projects bringing development and social services and in like before, like the state is unable to bring the services to the most remote communities and villages, and those services will be guaranteed by the companies. So there is a huge divisionism between people in the village, and it brings a lot of conflict.
Yeah.
Because members of the families are themselves divided. And when you conduct ethnographic research, it's very difficult to address how to deal with these different positions, because both arguments, the ones to protect the environment and the land and the culture, but also the how do we do then to get some money and to get some services, both are legitimate.
Yeah.
But so yeah, of course that indigenous politics is crossed by this, but I think that instead of saying indigenous peoples are divided, or like or that or such kind of argument or a way of explaining it, I think it's important to see how power structures function on the ground, and how these are shaping the different positions among villager, like community people. Yeah, because many times the argument is they are self-interest driven, like indigenous peoples have self-interest driven. And I think it's much more complex than that. It's a lot of inequality embedded in those territories.
So this was a super complex question of sort of internal ambitions that are different, and what you want for the community, but there is different interests, but also who then is the guardian of the indigenous rights, which is, I think, also what you were talking about, because when you have, so also both in Norway with regard to the governance mechanisms, but also when it comes to who can have these agreements with the corporations, sort of who within the communities, that there's also this structural difference within the communities when it comes to it comes to do it.
Yeah, exactly. To Anna, what you just said actually about that it's much more complex than the suggesting that the indigenous groups or some of the indigenous individuals have certain self-interests, right? This is actually related to a paper that I'm going to be presenting with Andrew tomorrow. Part of colonialism is altering the interests that people potentially have, or altering the dependencies that they potentially have. So if you can generate certain kinds of economic development needs or interests on the parts of the indigenous communities, I mean, if you can sever them from their traditional forms of livelihood, then they become dependent, potentially, or desirous of the kinds of benefits that the corporations can provide if they can extend electrical lines, or, through this hydroelectric project on the river in Guatemala, for example. So yes, I mean, it works in these nefarious or highly complicated way.
Yeah.
So I was also curious about sort of in the Guatemalan context, when where the judicial mechanism doesn't seem to work for indigenous rights in the way that it maybe did to some extent. Are there other ways are there other paths that are being pursued to
So just to provide a bit more of the context, the Constitutional Court in Guatemala has done, like the last 25 years, a very good job on expanding indigenous rights. The issue is that there is no implementation or follow-up to those decisions and those rulings. And a lot comes because the institution doesn't have the
yeah,
like the
power
the power to comply no, to make the other institutions comply with the rulings. So the court has been ordering Congress to to issue a law forever, and Congress is just stuck. There is 4 different law proposals, and it is stuck because those proposals need to be consulted because it's the free prior informed consultation expectation. So it's it is a mess. It is like a puzzle on how to deal with the consultation and creating democratic mechanisms to include indigenous participation into administrative, legislative, or any other kind of decision and policy. And what has been happening a lot, because legislature is not the way, the judiciary now is not the way anymore. The executive was supposed to be right now a window of opportunity, but the executive is stuck within the previous model of agrarian property and not indigenous property and ownership. So there is not a venue there, and then it's social mobilization, and the social mobilization has been able to have some traction to mostly cancel or at least prevent some activity like extractive activities, but it's not a good moment now, and I think it's not a good moment anywhere. Like at least in Latin America, there is not such a good moment now to protect indigenous rights and land, and I think with the current events in the world is not a good moment.
No, then it's then the sort of paramount interests are overarching, and the need for resources and so on. Do you see how does this reflect in the cases that you know more?
Well, what you just said, Anna, about it's not a good moment for rights. There either because there's this ascendancy of the idea, this ascendancy of populism, and this idea that rights have gone too far, that they have constrained the will of the majority in ways that are anti-democratic, and that we need to sort of roll back the power of the courts or assert countervailing sort of rights of the majorities, right? Or because we're seeing sort of this ascendancy of the idea that might makes right.
Yeah.
That sometimes that if you have the ability to do something, maybe you just should, right? So for both of those reasons, and obviously we're seeing that, I mean, the most classic case in just the last couple of days is Donald Trump's reassertion of the desire to have actual American sovereignty over Greenland, which is itself an indigenous territory. But you also see this a little bit also another United States example. There is, in the US, the courts are still pretty powerful, but what you have seen through populist appointments in the courts, for example, is a change in the actual judicial officials themselves, like literally replacing more leftist with more conservative judicial officials who have different interpretations of indigenous rights. So there's a very strong possibility that within the next couple of years, we could see the U.S. Supreme Court overturning a particular case called Morton versus Mancari in the U.S., which is the main case that has allowed for in-group differentiated rights in the U.S. And a way that would be overturned is by reinterpreting that as a sort of like the New Zealand example, a race-based rather than a politically based group differentiation, right? And so you have these mechanisms both from within the courts, but also pushing down on the courts or just ignoring the courts entirely and saying the executive can do what they want, or power will, what is the famous saying, the infamous saying, power does what it wishes and the poor suffer as they must. Can't remember who said that. Yeah.
Maybe we could go back to Greenland because it's a very interesting case of, if you want, sort of both indigenous dilemmas and playing, power playing on indigenous politics.
Yeah, the Greenland one is such a weird case because, so I'm born and raised in the United States, and I still, have family there, and I feel like I'm still pretty in touch with the place. There has been an enormous amount of support for a lot of Trump's agenda in the United States, deporting undocumented migrants, that sort of stuff. There is almost zero, as far as I can see, popular support among Americans for owning Greenland. This seems like a purely Donald Trump's egoistic desire to be able to be an empire builder and expand the map of the United States, right? And what strikes me is that makes it unlikely that Donald Trump will actually want to take over Greenland is kind of what I was just saying about neocolonialism. There are in 2026, there are so many more nuanced means of extracting benefit from other peoples and other countries without physically taking over their territory, right? Corporations can go into Greenland and extract mining and petroleum and fisheries benefits from Greenland without necessarily a country having to own it, right? That was sort of the genius, if you will, of the nominal decolonization of Africa or Southeast Asia. Europe and North America figured out that you could nominally decolonize those places and your corporations would still have their claws in those places. And the same way with Greenland, the United States already has basically, has military bases in Greenland. It has the freedom to act militarily and security-wise and do whatever it wants with Greenland. So it seems a little bit ridiculous that the U.S. would need to take over Greenland. Greenland is already, to some degree, dependent on American corporations and American military deals. And it is incredibly triggering that Donald Trump would want to claim to colonize it, in part because, of course, it's an indigenous jurisdiction, right?
And then, of course, it was interesting to see so of course, what this does, it does a lot of things, this claiming of Greenland, and it captures attention when it wants attention away from somewhere else. But it also really affected politics in Greenland.
Yeah.
In a way that sort of tied Greenland much closer to Denmark in some ways.
Yeah, in some ways. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Greenland, of course, has a 300-year colonial history with Denmark and doesn't love Denmark and wants more autonomy. And so, in some ways, for Greenland, the best case scenario coming out of this, Donald Trump making overtures to Greenland and making Greenland seem geopolitically desirable, is that it would give Greenlanders, the Kalaalleq Inuit people, more leverage to negotiate a better deal with Denmark for more autonomy, more potentially financial support that would, because Greenland is within your lifetimes, Greenland will almost certainly be an independent state with a seat at the UN. It simply has to figure out a way to get there. The best case scenario is that this provides it even a way forward. The worst case is that it ends up under a different colonial rule than Denmark's.
Yeah. Do you have any perspectives on that?
I was hearing this morning in the radio an interview to in Copenhagen, the Greenland House Association.
Yeah.
And so they were interviewing Inuit people, and they were saying we have always been under the rule of somebody. So the US or Denmark, everything, both are, it doesn't matter. And I think that's that is something about the limits of democracy too, like democracy for whom? And what we have been saying from a long time ago in Latin America and mainly in Central America is that we could have like 40 years of democracy with a swing between left and right governments. It doesn't really matter for indigenous politics because redistribution doesn't happen. Economic redistribution doesn't happen because territorial control is permanent. I mean, when we were talking about democratic backsliding, it was like, yeah, there's a backsliding for sure, but there's been always a limitation in democracies itself when it comes to indigenous people's rights, because the core of private property, of extractivism, goes beyond the political cleavage of right of left or a autocratic democracy. From an indigenous perspective, it doesn't really variate.
So that's very interesting. So you're more pessimistic and you're more optimistic when it's Easting. What?
Yeah.
I can get at it.
Maybe not that
So I promise to open up. So if you just raise your hand and then say your name before, yes or no.
Thank you.
Touchdown.
I'm Susanne Rødseth. I'm deputy leader of the Roads and Public Transportation Committee of the Westland County.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking what you were discussing now. I think what Trump or like his government wants to do with Greenland is not influence it more. It's telling a story about how liberal democracies respect each other now and forward. I think that's the motivation. But my question would be for Anna. I think we can see some democratic backsliding in Norway as well. And I think, like, I voted in the Sami election for the first time last year. And I've been, like, inspired to get to know my roots by the activism the later years. And I think, like, many of the Sami activists will say that the power now is with the government more than the law institutions. And do you have some perspective of that as you have been here in Norway?
You can send it to Elin and then Anna can answer.
Okay, thank you. My name is Elin Skård.
I could like a couple of questions.
Do you want to answer, Anna?
I wanted Anna's but she wants you to. She wanted to think a bit more, so she wants. I think she agrees.
While Anna is thinking, I won't actually ask a question. I just want to commend you on a super interesting panel, and I would love to see a comparative paper on crossing the red line, because I really think there are some very interesting comparative perspectives here that can throw some intellectual light as well for the rest of the academic community on these issues. It's a super hot issue.
Yeah.
So please write a paper when you have it.
Yeah. Then develop a project. Yes. And yeah, so no, Edita, and then because I think you didn't have any disagreements with what Susanne was saying.
Hi, my name is Edita Roszko. I'm a research professor at CMI. I was just thinking very much about what you actually said, very interesting point about neocolonialism and how indigenous people become part also of the whole system. And I was just thinking, at this more philosophical reflection, actually, probably there is no answer, on Deepesh Chakrabarty argument about how actually we are living in the planetary epoch and how humans become basically the geological force which changing the earth system. And actually there is no escape, whether for indigenous people or not indigenous people, out of that. We created technosphere and our biological life depends on this technosphere and on the extraction of the resources, capitalism, globalism, and all that. And we know how to extract, we know how to maintain, but we don't know how to fix. So the question is how actually taking into relation the indigenous people with the planet, with the globe, with the environment, how actually they deal with that. Because on one hand, they are part of that, also become the geological force agency, which is negative agency. But on the other hand, they have this relationship as we all. So we are part of actually wider planetary system. And I think with this system, which is Earth, it's very difficult to say how it's escaped, especially that we are also have a plural views, ideas, and about how to solve that.
Any comments to that?
I
Go ahead.
have some
But-
comment on that. No, so one of the things I'm working on, it's on the the ontological ways of understanding this big disequilibrium. The people I work with in Guatemala, they don't call this thing the planetarian crisis or whatever. They call it the disequilibrium of this balance of the, how you say that, in Spanish, el soplo, the of the world, the and so the thing we are working with these people is okay, you don't have any venue like in politics or economics, because things like are in motion, right? But there is a way to coalesce in a different way, which is through the justice of the sacred. And in what the people I work with, they call it the awas, which is the spirit, like the balance of the like the heart. The awas, it's the heart of the territory of land of. And so the way they are trying to deal, but I think it's more like it has an impact on coalitions and in self organization, and it goes through the fire, through making justice and seeking justice in the mountains, not in the courts, but they go into the mountains in key points to restore balance through the fire. And that is something that it goes beyond socio-legal mobilization or political theory or whatever. It's a different way on how to relate to the territory.
Non-human, and acknowledging that we are part of the wider human actually. Then,
If you, yeah.
And in a way, I don't. Yeah, no, you can comment if you want.
Oh, I just actually, it's interesting, once again, getting your perspective on that, because of course that is I mean, not to overly essentialize indigenous worldviews and lifeways, but that very much reflects what I would say is a common indigenous viewpoint in Canada and the United States and other Anglo-settler territories, where there are, firstly, there's sort of maybe a frustration with the idea of Western status political mechanisms to make changes, and a sort of a desire to return to indigenous values, but also literally to return to, I mean, in some cases, there's in Australia, there's this thing called the Outland movement of people simply receding from the state and returning back to the land as an avenue for dealing with this, just simply disembedding from the Westphalian capitalist extractivist system that is, what is leading to this the Anthropocene, right? This,
And also an element of what you see sometimes with the sort of opposition activists and in very repressive conditions, like LGBT activists and very repressive conditions, even if it's that community building then becomes a focus, and it becomes a focus of a different type of agency.
Yeah.
But also as a survival mechanism in a way. So in addition to the more sort of philosophical or ontological project, it also has this alternative biomechanism. Any other? Yes, please. No, where? Who?
Oh, here, yeah. Thank you. No, you're following the call for the essentialization that you just mentioned. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about is there any alliance, coalition, common grounds during the last couple of years or so after the change in the administration in Guatemala between indigenous communities and other people that have gone through the same process of withdrawing from the mechanisms of liberal democracy, judiciary, and otherwise, because it seems from what you're saying, not only the historical legacies of colonialism in the case of indigenous communities, but what they are going through is sort of a common ground for much larger parts of the population in Guatemala, in Latin America, and elsewhere, right? And it looks, what you are saying, that these sort of episodes of people withdrawing from the litigation dimension of politics and going back to the land, unless it's only a nihilistic thing, which is going back there and let things happen, it has a lot of risk or potential. In the case of Chile, in particular, we've seen that, and the potential for political violence or forms of contesting the limits of this form of liberal democracy are up there, and in general are in connection with other political players or social groups. So I was wondering how that happens in the context of what Guatemala have gone through in the last 60 years or so. I just want to throw this out.
Yes, well, because we don't have so much time. So if somebody else wants to come in, you should do it now, or you might not get a chance. No. Yeah. So can I just add to this before you answer? I think this is also, I was also thinking about, you mentioned a little bit earlier, the criminalization of indigenous institutions to some extent, or organizations, but I think that the criminalization of protests is also sort of part of this picture, which of course has been happening for a long time in Chile with the Mapuche around energy projects and dams and so on. But I was just I just wanted to take that into your answer.
Yeah, so we need to take into account that the context in Guatemala, got unified many struggles, the territorial struggle, but also the corruption struggle, and the whole political system struggle. So because of the institutional complexity, there's many sectors that need to that are supposed to participate in different of these sectors in these struggles. So these sectors have been doing a very interesting, but a bit similar than what has been happening here in Norway. There's been a lot of communication with indigenous movements, with environmental movements, with university student movements, and independent lawyers movements. So because all of them have a key participation in some of the different mechanisms to appoint judges or to appoint the lawyers that will participate in different processes. So there's been like a very interesting, and also diplomacy. Diplomacy are also is also involved in these struggles, and international cooperation. So you see sometimes, like in Maya ceremonies, with all those people around the fire, with doing things. So, like beyond doing the fire, there is kind of social tissue or political tissue that is being built through different means. It's not anymore only the meetings in a conference room. It's also meetings around the fire. And that is, I think it's super important to expand how political action takes place. And maybe it's a way of decolonizing. I don't know. I doubt it. But at least it's a different repertoire, right? Less capitalistic, less. Yeah, and I cannot answer to your question because I haven't been long enough here to. I know that people in the room can answer that question.
So we're going to close, but I would like to hear if you have. Do you have any final things that you'd like to say?
No, other than to say thank you to both of the two of you for, once again, for sort of bringing such. It is so useful to be able to do comparative work and to hear about perspectives from other places. So anyway, I really appreciate it.
And thank you both. This was wonderful. This was such a great start to the morning, and a little bit of sadness because it's towards the end of your stay. And thank you to all who came and who contributed. This was, I think we really need to think hard. And this is a way of encouraging that. So thank you so